Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to FPCI Public Lecture. We hope that you are in good spirits today. Today's forum is held in hybrid format, meaning that it is convened both online and offline. We are delighted to host over 80 people here today in person in Medcalf Diplomacy, as well as over 150 people tuning in online through our YouTube live stream. We have actually participants coming from over 15 countries, from Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, and many more. So welcome everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia is the largest foreign policy group in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia with over 100,000 people in our network. And today's forum is titled FPCI Public Lecture with Professor Rory Medcalf on Indo-Pacific Convergence, How Can Australia and Indonesia Maintain a Strategic Equilibrium? We would like to welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor Rory Medcalf, who is the head of the National Security College at the Australian National University. Everybody, please give a warm round of applause to Professor Rory Medcalf. And now, ladies and gentlemen, before we begin today's lecture, we would like to display a quick video introduction of FPCI. Please enjoy. Ladies and gentlemen, to open today's lecture, we would like to invite our founder and chairman, Dr. Dino Patijalal, to give his welcoming remarks. Dr. Dino, you may take over.
Good. Well, thank you. I'm not going to speak long. I'm just here to welcome my good friend, Professor Rory Medcalf. I just saw him in Raisina Dialogue in India, and you were in Munich also, right? Oh, yes. Okay, but he's definitely one of the foremost foreign policy strategic analysts of Australia. We have a very good relationship with Professor Rory Medcalf. He is the head of National Security College at the Australian National University since 2015. His expertise covers diplomacy, intelligence analysis, journalism as well. You were a journalist, okay, and including founding director at the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute. He was also a senior strategic analyst at the Office of National Assessment, and definitely widely experienced Australian diplomat. So welcome, Rory. You're among friends here. Rory is going to talk today about a concept that Foreign Minister Penny Wong has been talking about, which is a concept called strategic equilibrium. And I love this because when I was in government, we had a concept called dynamic equilibrium. So I look forward to hear what that actually means for Australia. So thank you, Rory. You can, for Indonesians who don't know him, you can consider him the Dino Jalal of Australia. And I would love to be called the Rory Medcalf of Indonesia. Yeah. So Rory, please, he will give a 20-minute talk. We'll ask some questions after that, and then all of you can field any questions you may. Okay, how are you? Yeah.
Look, thanks, Pak Dino, and that's high praise indeed. And in terms of energy, dynamism, youth and vigour, I'm afraid I cannot be the Dino Jalal of Australia, but we have a lot in common. And I'm really grateful for the audience. I'm grateful for the opportunity, the platform to speak today. I'm going to speak about strategic equilibrium, and we can relate that back to dynamic equilibrium, but I want to start on the Indo-Pacific, and I guess I want to proceed over the next 20 minutes or so to talk about, firstly, the Indo-Pacific strategic context, to talk about the challenges we face to regional stability, to regional peace, to regional prosperity, to regional order. And then I want to start talking about some concepts that I think can be very useful mobilisers and drivers for middle powers and middle players in the Indo-Pacific to make our contribution to keeping the region stable, to keep the region open, to keep the region prosperous, and keep the region really based on sovereignty and rules. And so at the end, I will talk a little bit about how we can leverage the multipolarity of the Indo-Pacific and how Australia and Indonesia can act as two of the core players in doing that. I'm very interested in your questions and the conversation afterwards, so I'll try to keep my remarks reasonably brief, and there is a clock in front of me that's very, very visible that will help me do that. So to begin with the Indo-Pacific, and I think the last time I spoke here, I did speak here I think in early 2019, which was a few months before the finalisation of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, and there was a very dynamic conversation here in Jakarta and really across ASEAN about the Indo-Pacific at that time, and so I was very pleased to engage with and contribute to that conversation then, and that's a reminder, I think, of the role that Indonesia has played and is playing in redefining the strategic landscape. So in 2019, if you cast your minds back to that, there was still a debate about the regional order. Many of the challenges that we're looking at now, including power rivalry, including the uses of Chinese power in particular, but also the transnational challenges across the region, many of those were already becoming evident back then. Of course, we at that stage had not been visited by the COVID-19 pandemic, but that's one example of the transnational shocks that really travel through the connectivity of the region to do damage to our peoples and our societies. In 2019, though, the regional strategic order was in a state of change, and many countries were seeking to develop frameworks for responding to that. There was a momentum towards redefining the region as a two-ocean system, as the Indo-Pacific, and that was really gathering force and momentum here in Indonesia. From my own experience working in Australian diplomacy and Australian analysis and the think tank world over many years, if you like, Australia and Indonesia were on parallel tracks. If you go back to a decade, go back to 2013, for example, where there was already talk of the Indo-Pacific in Indonesia framing policy. There was even, I think, an aspiration to develop essentially an Indo-Pacific treaty at that point from the Indonesian Foreign Minister, from Marty Natalegawa. But Australia, meanwhile, was formally redefining its region as a two-ocean system. The Australian Defence White Paper in 2013, I think, was the first formal document of any government in the world to redefine the region in that way. And this wasn't just creative language. It wasn't just because we were getting a little bit tired of the old Asia-Pacific rhetoric or East Asian rhetoric or, you know, Oceania or other regional framings. It was grounded in some basic realities, some structural realities of the region. And we could see this changing just as in Indonesia, you could see it changing, you experience the change. Connectivity, but also contestation across a two-ocean system. And much of that was to do with the way a rising China was expanding its influence and its interests and its capabilities across the two oceans, but also the way in which other powers were rising and using their own capabilities. But it was also a positive story about connectivity. If you look at flows of investment, flows of trade, flows of energy, flows of shipping. In a way, the region was returning to what it has been for thousands of years, which is an Indo-Pacific system. If you look at the history of the flows of cultures and trade and religion, indeed, that shaped this country, that was an Indo-Pacific story. So we were returning to that after, I think, a 20th century interruption to two-ocean connectivity. However, as the 2010s, I guess, unfolded, alongside the connectivity, we were also seeing the contestation. In my own view, although in China there is discomfort with the term Indo-Pacific because often various meanings are read into that term, especially when it's associated with American strategy or perhaps Japanese strategy, the reality is that China was acting as an Indo-Pacific power. You know, the Belt and Road, the Maritime Silk Road, which is the maritime side of the BRI, is effectively the Indo-Pacific with Chinese characteristics. If you look at China's infrastructure and investment and its security presence and influence in the Indian Ocean all the way to Africa, if you look at what's happening in the Pacific, I've just returned from Fiji, where I saw some of this on the ground. Of course, China has been expanding its influence across a two-ocean system. And some of that is understandable and normal, but some of that also is creating imbalances and frictions in the strategic environment that we need to deal with. And it's not only the American pushback against that, it's also the way in which it rubs up against the interests of others. So, to cut a long story short, 2019 was a pivotal year because when Indonesia developed its own Indo-Pacific policy and drove the ASEAN outlook, which was then formally adopted by the ASEAN 10, that was a signal to much of the world about this new orthodoxy, this resumed orthodoxy of the Indo-Pacific. Hence we have an EU Indo-Pacific policy. We have a German, a French, a British, a Dutch, a South Korean, Canadian. So many other countries have actually formally adopted Indo-Pacific policies, partly, in my view, as a consequence of the signal of legitimacy that the ASEAN outlook gave. So now we're in this Indo-Pacific era. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the challenges that lie ahead or that are around us, and then I want to move on a little bit to how multipolarity and indeed strategic equilibrium can be our friends if we work out how to leverage them. So I would define the challenges to the security, prosperity and sustainability of the region as twofold. This is obviously a simplification for those of you who study security issues and risk. Of course, there's a whole horizon of challenges here. But the two broad categories are, of course, the state-on-state or the interstate challenges and the transnational challenges, those that cross borders that don't have their origin in state behaviour. And the really difficult problem for the region is the intersection of those challenges. How, for example, does the response of developing countries in meeting their development needs, their education needs, their health needs, the mitigation or adaptation to climate change, how does all of that intersect with their desire to preserve sovereignty in the face of the power rivalries we're talking about, and particularly, in my view, the scale and impact of the influence of Chinese power on the region. That's where the real difficult policy decisions need to be made. But if you look at the problems, there is an overriding risk to regional stability in relations among states. It is related to the power tensions that, in my view, arise not only from the rise of Chinese power and the way that power has coercively been used, but the way in which it clashes with the interests and indeed sometimes the assertiveness of others. It's not just a US-China story, and I think that's a really important thing to understand. This is a multipolar region. There are other players. Some of them are, middle powers in a classic definition, but often they're very, very substantial countries. Japan and India, in many ways, are so much more than middle powers, and they've got their own fundamental differences with China that we see. I will let you in the room from Indonesia define Indonesia's role. I think we saw in the FPCI message, if you like, a kind of middle power role for Indonesia. But of course, if you project the growth of the Indonesian economy, the scale of the Indonesian population, Indonesia's own civilizational footprint as well, as this century unfolds and as you move towards the centenary of Indonesian independence, Indonesia is more than a middle power. Australia defines itself as a middle power, but of course it has all sorts of substantial strengths as well. If it's the 12th or 13th largest economy in the world, in some ways that's more than a middle power too. My key point though is that this is a region where, although the US and China are the two largest economies with the two largest defence footprints by a significant margin, nonetheless there are other powers that have agency and influence and can project and defend their interests and will. And so we need a regional order that not only can accommodate all of that, but also actually can leverage that multipolarity as an advantage rather than a disadvantage. So the first set of challenges, the state-on-state threats, and those could take the form of essentially threats, as in deliberate aggressive action, deliberate coercive action, the ultimate fear, of course, being a major conflict, perhaps initiated or probably initiated by Chinese aggression or an attack upon Taiwan, but also conflict that could arise through miscalculation or accident that could occur elsewhere across the region. But there are also other challenges. If you look at the day-to-day relations among powerful countries in the region, there are other flashpoints too, including, of course, on the Korean Peninsula or in the South China Sea or the East China Sea. And the other set of risks, of course, are the transnational risks. In other words, not only the impact of threats like terrorism or violent extremism, but also pandemic, and of course, above all, the risks, indeed not the risk, the reality of the impacts of climate change on human welfare, on development, and on indeed the sustainability of the environment around us. All of this is unfolding essentially at the same time, and it can be a pretty depressing story to listen to when you put it that way. But I think ranged against that, there's an enormous amount of potential in the region that isn't yet fully tapped, and I think one of the responses that we're now looking at is the way in which so many societies and countries are looking at national resilience as a foundation for their response. If we're going to build solidarity among nations to manage these risks, we have to do it as strong nations, to begin with, strong nations that are able to either withstand risk in the first place or bounce back quite actively, quite quickly. And COVID has been an interesting test of that for many of our societies. It's been a terrible, terrible experience, and you don't need me to tell you that here in Jakarta, but it's also been an interesting study to see how nations cope and how they adapt and how they bounce back. So the state-on-state risks, the transnational risks, and I should add in that list of transnational risks, the risks to social cohesion as well, including from misinformation. And so how do we respond to this? Well, looking at the capabilities of the region, we should be confident about how we go forward. We shouldn't just be despairing and feeling that our nations lack power or our nations lack agency or that we lack institutions, because there are institutions in the Indo-Pacific that, in my view, are not utilised and not leveraged enough. And some of those are the ASEAN-centric institutions. And of course, that puts certain expectations on the shoulders of Indonesia as ASEAN chair this year. So moving towards ways forward, I want to introduce this concept. It's not mine to introduce, but I want to recapitulate this concept of strategic equilibrium, which is a term that the Australian Foreign Minister has used quite a lot in the past year and has developed in a number of speeches and a number of engagements, but which I think is also a concept that is yet to be fully elaborated and where there's scope for Australia's partners to help us put it into practice. So it sounds at one level just like a kind of creative expression, but there's a lot, as with the idea of dynamic equilibrium, there's a sophistication to it that needs to be explained and unpacked. One of the responses that I think is necessary to the strategic challenges in the region is a balance of power. It is effectively deterrence, and that in itself has the potential to be destabilising, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the other side of it is what you might call risk reduction, confidence building, reassurance, guardrails, which is a term that's often been used in recent years. And I read strategic equilibrium as a kind of yin and yang, where you have balance of power on the one hand, but the reassurance on the other hand. And the two need to proceed in lockstep. And I think that's where the real test for Australian diplomacy enters the picture, and that's also a real test for the diplomacy of friends and partners in the Indo-Pacific. So I would argue there's a challenge to leverage the multipolarity of the region, the fact that it is a region of many powers, of many players, in ways that are stabilising and not destabilising. At the moment, and I'll look at the example of Australia's own defence modernisation, AUKUS is one element of that, but not the only element of that. There's no question that Australia is trying to strengthen itself as a military power to defend our interests in a contested region. And it's interesting that this is not the only piece of the puzzle. If you look at Japan's defence spending, if you look at India, if you look at, on the other side of the world, countries like Sweden and Finland joining NATO, there's clearly an anxiety among middle powers about their security in a world where we're seeing outright aggression in Europe from Russia, and we're seeing acts of coercion and intimidation in the Indo-Pacific. So middle powers are looking to their strengths, either internal balancing or external balancing, really to protect their interests. At the same time, it's to be acknowledged that as more countries increase their capabilities, of course questions are raised as to what the purpose of this is, and China itself makes accusations that somehow it's other countries that are causing instability or arms racing. The reality, in my view, is that many other countries are playing catch-up to the massive military modernisation China's undertaken over the past 25 years. And we're also looking at an international environment where, tragically, war between states is a real thing. It's a reality. It's not, if you like, the bad dream that we were hoping it would be some years ago. Now, what does this have to do with the multipolarity of the region? I think that's where, in several ways, we are underutilising what we have at our disposal. Firstly, of course, the regional institutions. And the Indo-Pacific, for all of the debate about what it means, the back and forth and so on, the Indo-Pacific actually has a ready-made set of regional institutions. Just because countries like Australia and Indonesia have adopted our own Indo-Pacific visions doesn't mean we need to invent some grand new regional institution to put this into practice. In fact, in some ways, the drivers of the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting +8, all of these ASEAN-centric institutions that were born in the late 20th century and the early 21st century were actually Indo-Pacific institutions that were being established ahead of their time. So established without the name, but if you look at the membership, including India in all cases, there's an Indo-Pacific footprint there. And some of those institutions, in fact all of them, have founding mandates that include ideas like confidence building measures, preventive diplomacy, strategic stability, transparency, all of the qualities that we need to prevent power rivalries turning into confrontation or conflict. But it's very easy for me to say, let's do more with those institutions when the institutions have diverse memberships. They're bound by the consensus rules that are both, in my view, a strength and also a weakness of the ASEAN-centric system. And there are powerful countries in those institutions that clearly do not want those institutions to be used for purposes that constrain the behaviour of powerful states. So what do? I think that's where small groups actually have an advantage. And so there's a false dichotomy that's sometimes set up between inclusive multilateralism in our region and minilateralism or bilateralism. You know, bilateralism being the key bilateral relationships, the ones that can make a difference. And for Australia and a number of other countries, of course, the security relationship with the United States is very high, in fact, at the top of that list. But there are other relationships that matter too. I've just come back from Delhi, as you were hearing from Pakdino, where the Australia-India relationship has, over the last 20 years, had quite a meteoric rise. The Australia-Japan relationship, but the Australia-Indonesia relationship too is one that has a long history, a high degree of confidence, a significant degree of trust. I was noting, actually, Pakdino, at the Australian Embassy, they have a wonderful display showing the role of photographs, showing the role of Australia in Indonesian independence. So there's a kind of a legacy there that we can renew and revive about Australia and Indonesia as middle powers working together. And I think bilaterals or trilaterals, or even the Quad, and we can talk about the Quad more perhaps in the Q&A, all of these groups actually can form caucuses or drivers of ideas and initiatives within the multilateral institutions. One grouping, for example, which I recall in a track 2 or track 1.5 format some years ago we did some work on, was Australia, Indonesia and South Korea, for example. And there are others where each side brings something to the table in ideas, in assessments, in capability. And if we can find initiatives we can agree on, we can actually try to use the multilateral forums to drive change, to drive ideas towards more practical outcomes. And what are those practical outcomes? Well, I don't think that if at least one great power wants a hostile relationship or wants to take aggressive action, none of this will work. You know, CBMs, confidence building measures, risk reduction, transparency, none of it works if there is actually aggressive intent. But I think the test here, and particularly a test for China, is to demonstrate that in fact their intent is defensive, their intent is stabilising, and the way to do that is to engage wholeheartedly in confidence building and risk reduction measures. And I mean practical things like communications between militaries, communications between paramilitaries or auxiliaries or other forces that are, particularly at sea, engaging often in risky behaviour. I mean hotlines, I mean codes of conduct, and of course, in the case of Indonesia and ASEAN, the code of conduct for the South China Sea is one of those big tests that we should all be, if you like, supporting a substantial outcome on. So, in a way, I'm not holding out too much hope here, because in the end, there's only so much we can do with multilateral institutions if a great power has intentions that are to use risk as a tool of statecraft. But the time for testing, I guess, testing the good faith of major powers is now, because if we look at the strategic environment, if we look at what's happened in Europe with Russia's aggression, if we look at the warnings about what could happen across the Taiwan Strait or elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific in the years to come, we really don't have any time to lose. And I think, just to conclude on this note, the more that we can minimise the risk of conflict and confrontation in the Indo-Pacific in the years ahead, the more we can actually focus regional institutions on those public goods objectives that really human development is about and really human welfare is about. In Australia, we have a government that I don't think came to power wanting to have a huge national security agenda. We have a progressive government that's very focused on, for example, climate change, and indeed a foreign minister who's very focused on diplomacy as a tool of statecraft. But at the same time, this is a government that will continue to strengthen Australia's defensive capabilities, because they see the strategic environment that they didn't choose, but that frankly is a reality around us. And I think there's a similar narrative for many other countries in the region and the world. that poses, I think, interesting questions and challenges for our friends in Indonesia. But just to conclude, it also offers opportunities for statecraft, and I think that with creative in your redefinition of Indonesian foreign policy, the time for creative thinking is now. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rory. And by the way, don't worry about the clock. The clock is wrong anyways, right? So, look, Rory, you and I believe in multipolar Asia, and I think Indonesia and Australia's interests is served well by a crowded multipolar Asia, which is abiding to a rules-based world order. Right, so obviously that's the best guarantee for peace and progress. But I just want to get a little bit deeper on this. When we talk about multipolarity, can we be clear about who are the poles, right? Obviously, the U.S. is one pole, right? And let's be clear: a pole is a center, a country where we see a number of other countries gravitate towards, right? It doesn't have to be an alliance system, but that country will have pull around with those other countries. China is definitely one pole, although it behaves differently than the US. Do you consider Japan or India a pole? Yeah.
So I decided not to inflict slides on you, but I could at this point introduce a slide with a list of poles. And so I would definitely start with, obviously, the US and China as the big two, but I certainly think that India and Japan have a status as independent poles in that system. And I think, yes, you can say, well, Japan's a US ally, but like a lot of US allies, it also has very strongly independent views about its place in the world. And I think, like the key US allies here in the Indo-Pacific, we've made an independent choice to be a US ally. So let's look at India and Japan as poles 3 and 4. But there are others. So I think South Korea is a significant and in many ways emerging regional power with global interests. And we're finally seeing, after about 10 years or 12 years, a government in South Korea that's recognising that as well. Because if you look at Korea having a blue water navy, technology power, not to mention a cultural power, it stands alone in many regards. I see Indonesia in an interesting way here. I see Indonesia as having two facets. I mean, of course, Indonesia as a leader in ASEAN, and I think ASEAN itself, to the extent that it can mobilise, is a pole. But over the next 10, 20 years, Indonesia is becoming a pole in itself. Maybe it's one already, a pole in itself. So I think we have to think of Indonesia also as an independent power. And Australia, while by many measures we're smaller than those other countries, I would see as playing an outsized role. So let's call Australia a pole. Beyond that, I would look at Europe and say, well, Europe is a stakeholder in the Indo-Pacific, and that includes Europe as the EU, but also particularly European powers, especially France, to some extent Germany and the United Kingdom, if we can call that European at the moment, and I think we can. So it's a multipolar region, and again, let's watch change. Let's look 20 years from now and see where Bangladesh is at, for example. Whatever it is, it ain't unipolar and it ain't bipolar.
But in your definition of polarity, should that country that consider itself a pole have the capacity to shape the policies of other countries? Is that a definition of a pole? Because by that definition, Indonesia doesn't consider itself a pole because we don't aspire for other countries to gravitate around us, although we do have diplomatic initiatives. Yeah. So.
Yeah, look, I am projecting over about a generational time frame. So I'm looking at about 25 years into the future. And if you look at projections for the Indonesian economy by 2045, I think Indonesia will be a pole. I think whether the intent is there or not, I think there'll be some sort of gravitational effect that we need to be ready for, and that can be benign. It should be benign, but I think in the end we can't retreat from that. And even a country like Australia, I think Australia aspires to play a kind of shaping role in the region. There are some parts of the region where we're more effective as a shaper than others, and we always shape much more effectively when we're working with friends. I just would add one qualification to what I've said, because in a military sense, or in sense of absolute economic weight, of course the US and China stand distinct. It's just that many of these other poles are quite capable of looking after themselves. And I think India is a classic example. It's a country that perhaps it can't bend other countries to its will, but it certainly can't have its will bent by other countries. You know, it can't be intimidated by anyone. And I think that increasingly we're going to see that kind of hardening in the region. If you want to be really academic about it, you could say that we've got a kind of mixture of bipolarity and multipolarity. So maybe heteropolarity is the best way to describe the region, but maybe that's a little bit too academic.
Yeah, and also it's not so rigid, yeah, because for example, Pakistan is a U.S. ally, but Pakistan is very much close to China, yeah, and the Philippines also has a treaty relationship with the United States, but of course during Duterte time, they were more aligned to China in my view than in the U.S. So it's more complicated these days, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, you know, again, a lot of this is definitional, but one of my favourite definitions of a major power is a country that essentially can protect its interests from coercion or intimidation against others, not necessarily a country that can make others bend to its will unless they're very small countries. And by that measure, I think the list of major powers is actually growing.
Okay. So you talk about strategic equilibrium, right? And very interesting. What I want to know is, if you look at power relationship now, at what point would you say that, oh, an equilibrium has been achieved? What are the metrics? And what are the metrics by which you say, oh, now we have a disequilibrium, right? Because, you know, what I see now, the US definitely, in hard power terms, is very dominant, right? It's the hegemonic power. $700 billion of defense budget, I think twice more than China, and more than the rest of the 10 or 15 countries combined, right? So, you know, how do you read into that? Is that an equilibrium that we have now, or is that something else? So, if China grows, does that mean that are we going to see disequilibrium or equilibrium? Because China will say, "Hey, I want to match that," so then there will be a equilibrium. Yeah.
So I'm going to have a friendly argument with you about this, because, look, I think at one level, yes, you can look at the aggregate of American defence spending globally and say, well, that's bigger than China, a lot bigger than China, therefore the US dominates. But if you look at the Indo-Pacific, and particularly at the Western Pacific, but the whole Indo-Pacific, it's a very different story. I think in many ways the story of Chinese military modernisation over the last 30 years has been to move to a dominant position in the Indo-Pacific, because in any of the particular theatres of risk, places where conflict could occur, South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, East China Sea, China seeks to overmatch others. And in fact, the relatively small proportion of absolute US power that can be brought to bear in each of these regions is either overmatched or at risk of being overmatched by China. And so the question then becomes really about, I guess, not so much a disequilibrium of actual hard power at any given time, but a disequilibrium in terms of the degree of risk that countries are willing to take. And one of the things that scares me is that in the past 10 to 15 years, China has been willing to play with the idea of risk. So that's why, for example, if you study in the South China Sea, the way a lot of Chinese forces have behaved, they actually want us to think that they're going to do something crazy, even if they're not. Australian aircraft have been challenged, the ships and aircraft of many countries have been challenged. And although no actual crisis eventuates, at the time, many of us worry that things could get out of hand. So I think we are already entering a state of disequilibrium because there is uncertainty about what will happen next. There's no sense of certainty. There's a heightened sense that something could go wrong, either deliberately or accidentally, and that in some ways is a little bit distinct from, you know, the hard material balance of forces, because let's face it, we've seen in the Ukraine conflict how what seemed to begin as a localised act of aggression in Europe had global repercussions. And we know that a major act of war or conflict in the Indo-Pacific, again, would have immediate global repercussions. I've separately used the term settling point to talk about what we're looking for in the region. That's an idea I developed in my book on the Indo-Pacific a few years ago. And I think that's got a kind of a resonance with the idea of strategic equilibrium, because we're not looking for a permanent solution to all the region's problems. That's much more than diplomacy can achieve. That's going to require deep investment of national effort by all of our countries, by the private sector and others over many years. But we need diplomacy to create the conditions whereby a more secure, sustainable future for the region can be achieved. And that diplomacy needs to reach a kind of equilibrium or settling point in the behaviour between nations. Power balance is part of that, but the crisis management, the confidence building, the diplomatic signalling is also a part of that. My view is that we won't be there until we can be absolutely sure, for example, that the calculations in China are that risks of conflict are simply not worth the effort of confrontation, and that in fact China's interests can be met without, if you like, fundamental changes to the regional status quo. And that will involve others providing reassurance as well. But I do think that the perceptions for that actually have to start in Beijing and in the way a lot of our countries relate to China.
Is the Quad an expression of the strategic equilibrium efforts that Australia is pursuing at the moment? And I do think, one of the most geopolitically significant event in the Indo-Pacific is the formation of the Quad, and I've been really taken surprised by how rapid it has developed, you know, at the level of activities, the scope of the programs, the frequency of the meetings. I noticed, for example, the Japanese foreign minister did not go to G20 in India, but attended the Quad meeting, right? So, you know, that says a lot. So I'm just saying, where do you think Quad is heading? Because it's really going really fast, yeah.
Yeah, and you and I think we're both there in Delhi watching the Quad Squad on stage at the Raisina dialogue. And I think I was also struck by the chemistry among the four ministers, the fact that they spent an hour talking. They said a lot more about the Beatles than they did about China in that hour on the stage in Delhi. So, you know, I think like a lot of the Indo-Pacific strategic architecture, there's a kind of ambiguity about the Quad. And you know, I think we kind of almost need to cherish the ambiguity, the duality of a lot of the ways that countries in this region are responding to the strategic environment. Why is that? It's not because it sends mixed signals, it's actually because it gives others a choice. So I think, you know, the Quad is not a military alliance, it's not hard balancing, but there is some signalling to China going on there. It's saying that, look, these four countries are getting concerned about the regional order, and therefore they're building more trust with themselves and with each other, and they're experimenting with how they can aggregate their capacity. And I don't mean their armed forces, but I mean their capacity in delivery of public goods, in technology, diplomatically. Now, that could go one way or another depending on how China behaves in future. And I think the Quad has had other advantages. It's actually made sort of the region safe for bilateralism and trilateralism, because it's become the lightning rod for a lot of China's unhappiness, and I think a little bit unfairly. I think if you look at the communique that came out last week, and previous Quad meetings, at least since the Biden administration arrived on the scene, it's overwhelmingly about what can the Quad do as partners in the region: delivery of public goods, vaccines, environmental monitoring, and so forth. I think a test that lies ahead is how do we connect the Quad with the ASEAN-centric architecture. It may be a bridge too far to say that there should be a formal Quad-ASEAN dialogue mechanism, for example, but individual Quad partners, and Australia I think is a good example, maybe Japan as well, maybe India, could be the gateways for basically signalling in the EAS or other ASEAN-centric institutions, how can the Quad help? And can we maybe do Quad plus activities on a case-by-case basis where there's an issue or a natural disaster or some other issue where the Quad can be helpful. So the Quad is here to stay. And I think in some ways, the more that China wastes its effort getting upset about the Quad, the more counterproductive it looks, because I think comfort levels with the Quad are growing.
Okay. China, you know, FPCI have been having a lot of discussions on China with Southeast Asia and with Western countries, you know, Europe, United States, and Australia. Two narratives, Rory, and help me figure this out. The Southeast Asians say to the West, you guys are too harsh, too mistrustful, right? Hopeless. The West says to us, you guys are too naive, too trustful. Are we both right, or are we both wrong, or who's right or wrong? Yeah.
Well, I don't like to generalise about Southeast Asia, and I don't particularly like the term the West. So I'll answer your question, but with that kind of caveat. Look, I'm going to answer a question you haven't asked as well, which is about Australia-China relations. You may be getting to that, but I want to bring that into the conversation because that's actually something of an interesting metaphor for the journey that we're all on with regard to China. I see myself as a lapsed China engager. I think that's a very honourable place to be at the moment. And that is that the China we're dealing with now is not the China of 15 years ago, when I think a lot of us invested a lot of hope in China as a partner in a very comprehensive way, and where you could have, for example, very open dialogue, conversation with Chinese academics and scholars and think tanks, where you didn't just get the party line on every issue. But China has changed, and that's a point that Australian governments have made in recent years. It's one of the reasons why Australian governments did take a very firm position, a very firm national interest and national security position with regard to China since about 2016. And Australia was punished for that economically, and we've withstood that, and now we're trying to stabilise the relationship. So where we're at now, and this goes to, if you like, striking the right balance in relations with China, I think the direction the Australian government's taking now is not a reset. It's not, let's go back to the happy days of pre-2016, when we were more focused, it seemed, on the economic benefits and perhaps a little bit blind to the security risks. Let's develop a new normal where we want mutual respect, but mutual respect begins with our own national self-respect and our own national resilience, and ensuring that having economic relations with China doesn't turn into a kind of dependency or the potential for the infiltration of our critical infrastructure or things like that, or indeed interference with our very vibrant Chinese diaspora community. And so what the government in Australia is trying to do is to send a signal to China that we want stabilisation, we want dialogue. I think China made a big mistake in cutting off dialogue with Australia a number of years ago, because if we're going to achieve stability and equilibrium and avoid crisis and confrontation in the regional order, everyone needs dialogue with China, and China needs dialogue with everyone. So I think that is kind of a starting point for the new balance we're striking. And the point you make about Southeast Asia and the West, and I wouldn't say the West, I'm assuming you mean Europe, United States, maybe you mean Australia, maybe you mean Japan, and I would put Australia and Japan perhaps a little bit east of West in that regard. But yes, those are countries that have heightened risk perceptions regarding China. I think one of the big mistakes that we will make in this region is if we look at Europe and think that Europe is still looking at China only through a commercial lens. Europe has now heightened risk perceptions about China, and the China-Russia relationship has a big part to play in that. So I think you'll be hearing this more and more, but it's certainly this sort of difference of views. But I think we need to find ways of moderating that conversation, because we all still want stable, mutually beneficial relations with China, and I still hold out enough hope that in time there will be enough voices in the Chinese system that recognise that playing with risk is not wise policy. It's just that in order to help that debate shift within China, we need that balance, that strategic equilibrium, if you like, that balance of hard balancing, and that includes deterrence, with engaging diplomacy. It's going to be a really tense 3, 5, 10, 15 years to get there. But if the PLA can wake up every morning and say not today when they look across the Taiwan Strait, and if we can have effectively relations where our populations see benefit in economic relations with China, but are building, if you like, resilience and firewalls against China turning that into a gateway for coercion, then I think we will get to a state where there can be a more cooperative future. Because don't forget, China has problems too, including declining demographics.
Yeah. I'll be honest with you, Rory. There was a time in Indonesia where many of our policymakers thought the Western countries wanted to weaken Indonesia and divide Indonesia. You know, there was that degree of paranoia, and I'm glad it's not there anymore, or at least to a large degree. I'm just wondering, what do you think China misunderstands about the West? You know, judging from their rhetorics, yeah.
Okay, again, I'm adopting your term, the West, just for the sake of the conversation. Look, and I'll use Australia as an example.
Yeah. Sorry, China talks about the West all the time.
I know. That's why I'm not. Look, but I'll use Australia as an example. So there was a view, I think, in China that this was a country that didn't have kind of inner strength, that this was a country that was simply interested in two things, in the commercial relationship, but also in free riding off the US alliance. And to some extent that was probably true. You know, I think there was 15 years ago, there was a bit of that happening in the Australian debate. But both of those things have changed. And so, of course, we still want economic prosperity. And of course, we also don't want to turn into Sparta. We don't want to spend too much on defence. So of course we want the best of both worlds if we can have it. But I think there has been a hardening of national security thinking in Australia in a broad, inclusive way, not in a kind of exclusionary way over the past decade, to say, well, we need to do more to protect ourselves, and we need to pay some costs in order to do that. And if that includes incurring some short-term pain in the relationship with China, so be it. So I think China has probably looked at a lot of the West in the same way. It's probably looked at Europe through a lens of, well, they just want to get rich from us, and they're a declining set of institutions with a lack of will. So let's take advantage of that. But instead, I mean, if you look at the European response to the Ukraine war, you know, we're suddenly reminded that Europe is actually a continent that was shaped by 1,000 years of war. You know, Europe is a continent that actually has not really taken a holiday from history like we all imagined, but actually has some inner strength and some willingness to endure and to take a stand. And so China's beginning to look at that and think, well, maybe we need to recalibrate, because I think one thing China does fear is the idea that of what China sees as the three most important poles in the world, and I believe that is China, America and Europe, not Russia, not India, not Japan. If China finds that Europe is wholeheartedly on the side of the United States in that contest, then China loses kind of automatically. And if you think about Europe cutting off the umbilical cord of technology and economic relations with China in the event of a Taiwan crisis, that's a shock that I think China's still not ready for.
Questions? Wow. All right. Gentleman there. Andy in the back from the Foreign Ministry. The gentleman, former FPCI guy, glasses. I haven't seen him in a while. Okay, good. We don't have women, really? Come on. We need gender balance. Anyone?
Agreed.
Anyone? Okay, the lady in red, yeah. By the way, welcome to Lydia and Antoine from Canada and Eria, yeah, good friends, yeah. All right, please, yeah.
Okay, thank you. My name is Rio. I'm from Universitas Gadjah Mada. I'm a postgraduate student. Okay, first off, I want to ask you about the the interdependence between Indonesia and Australia and its geopolitical implication in terms of the strategic equilibrium. Because since the 50s, Indonesia is at crossroads and still at the crossroads. Meanwhile, at least from what I have learned, that Australia is pretty much isolated in terms of geopolitical. So if Indonesia is, as hypothetically taken on a hard stance on the balance between on the dynamics in Indo-Pacific region, then pretty much Australia is, you can say, lose its pivotal ally in the Indo-Pacific region. And how, the interdependence between Indonesia and Australia and its geopolitical implications. Thank you.
Take them one at a time, or let's take a few?
Take a few.
Because then I can dodge the hard ones, right? So, okay.
The lady in red,
My name is Esther. I'm a Nigerian-born Indonesian. I just want to ask, when you talk about how Australia can support us in terms of the strategic equilibrium, our human capital, it's very important because it's very crucial in all of this foreign policy. What are you actually doing? Because we need to match up with the global power, like you said, but I feel like we're still a growing economy, that our human capital here in Indonesia, it's not really crucial and prepared for this 2025. What is Australia going to do to support this, to build us to that level?
Okay. Andy in the back.
Hi, Professor Medcalf. It's nice to meet you. I've read your book, Empire of the Indo-Pacific. Basically, my question is related to...
You're the other one. You're the other guy who read the book.
Yeah. But basically, I just want to have one question, Professor. And you mentioned about this a lot in your speech just now, regarding the way forward, because you mentioned a lot of good points. And I want to try to tie this in with the momentum of Indonesia's chairmanship this year. And the trends that you mentioned, AUKUS, Quad, and now Japan also has its own new security initiative way back in December last year. And this year, you also mentioned about the enormous potential, but that also is related to transnational risk and state-to-state risk, which is also a security aspect. But in the case of Indonesia's chairmanship, we want to kind of push economic cooperation in the implementation of the AOIP. Now, I just want to ask you, in your view as an academician from Australia, how do you see this? Because it's always a recurring theme that Indonesia tries to promote, but to what extent is this going to help diffuse the tensions in the geopolitical context? Because it's like we're saying this one way, but it's not responding. Just like Indonesia, we just met with the Japanese counterparts, FM, in a strategic dialogue. Even the economic aspect was not really discussed in the Indo-Pacific implementation kind of context. And then you mentioned also about, in your book, Indonesia as a dark horse, right? Which is able to exploit great powers with diplomatic balancing. Can you explain more about this diplomatic balancing in terms of this new geopolitical landscape? Because indeed, this year is a very important year. We want to make sure that it's going to be a defining time for Indonesia, but how can we do that? Thank you, Professor.
And finally, gentleman in back.
Hello, Professor. My name is Haikal. I'm from FPCI Universitas Airlangga Surabaya. I want to ask you about the current dynamics of Australia's and China's relationship. As you said before, that during the administration of PM Anthony Albanese, that both China and Australia have been warming up. So I want to ask you, like, what are the consideration and maybe the dynamics that makes both of them warming up to each other? And also, I want to ask you about your hope for the future of Australia's and China's relations. Thank you.
I'm going to start there and work my way backwards. It'll make me easier to remember the questions, I hope. So I talked a bit about Australia-China relations already, and again, I think a bit of this is misunderstood. I think there's a view, certainly, that China propagated that Australia was becoming actively hostile to China in recent years, and there's now a view that some people think Australia has essentially completely reversed and is backing down on all of its national security position with regard to China. Whereas, of course, I think the reality is quite consistent. It's just that one thing we did see change was the political rhetoric. I think in retrospect, going back 7 years, as we began what I would call the reality check in Australia-China relations, and I was one of the voices encouraging that reality check, we needed to bring risk and security much more into the frame, and we needed to create a kind of a new normal in the relationship where we could protect Chinese Australians from being harassed or from interference from the Chinese Communist Party, where we could screen foreign investment with national security considerations in mind, where we could make criminal the act of foreign political interference, which wasn't the case previously. And a lot of those activities, while they were responding to concerns about China, they were also country agnostic. They were also aimed at any country in future that would seek to interfere in Australia. So, for example, recently our Home Affairs Minister, in a speech that I hosted at my college, announced that there had been a plot uncovered by Iranian agents to harass Australian citizens. So the laws apply to everyone. Where we've come from that is a government that is, in some ways, adjusting the diplomacy, much more disciplined public rhetoric. I think they're being very careful not to be excessive or gratuitous in the way that they talk about China, but they're not frightened to continue the national security hardening that we need, the defence acquisitions. They're keeping all of the national security settings in place, the laws and the protections and so forth. They're just, they're trying to build a bigger stick, but they're talking softly. And that's actually good statecraft. So it's really up to China now as to how it responds to that new maturity in Australian policy. And at the moment, China is responding. But that's partly, I think, because China's had trouble on many fronts. You know, the impact of COVID-0, the slowing growth of the Chinese economy, the demographic problems at home, the impact of the Ukraine war and China's terrible miscalculation, I think giving Putin a green light for that war. All of these things mean that China's being more careful in the way it behaves with middle powers, but that may not be permanent. So we're ready, I think, for different plausible futures. On the Indo-Pacific, and thank you for reading my book. So I think that was very cruel, Pactino. There's been at least 3 readers because I made my wife read it as well. So as one of my best editors and critics. Look, where do we go from here? I think, you know, in the book I look at, as I said, the idea of a strategic settling point, and I do talk quite a lot about confidence building measures in the final chapter of the book. But of course the world's moving very quickly, and indeed that book was published a few years ago. The latest edition was last year, and already now we have new dynamics occurring. So I think I would just go back to that theme of using the regional institutions. You talked about the ASEAN chair role from Indonesia this year. It's not for me to sort of give advice to Indonesia, I guess, but the way I read things is that the challenge for Indonesia is twofold. I mean, Indonesia, if I can say Indonesia need a tangible outcome from this year's ASEAN chairmanship. It's likely that next year's ASEAN chair will be less active, if I dare say, than Indonesia. So I think Laos is chair next year. So this is an opportunity to be active and to pick up the slack in implementation of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. So you need some tangible outcomes, but they will probably be quite limited and quite small and quite practical, and they probably do need to be in the economic space. So that could be, for example, to do with shared standards in the region for, you know, some shared standards and principles for infrastructure and connectivity in the Indo-Pacific. And those are standards and principles that maybe China can meet, maybe it can't meet, but again, that's a choice for China to make, because in many ways the standards and principles for infrastructure in the region should be exactly the same standards and principles if somebody wants to build a new development, you know, in the piece of land behind your house. You want good environmental protections, you want employment of local labour, you know, you want transparency, you want commercial viability, you want all of those things. But the second piece of the puzzle is that Indonesia does need to play a long game. And again, I'm sure you have officials who are thinking strategically about this, but the last thing we want is at the end of this year to say, well, that's great, we succeeded in our 1 year of ASEAN chairmanship, we've solved all the problems of the Indo-Pacific, we can stop being active and creative. You've got to play a long game too. And I think the long game is actually much more about security, about building blocks for security, for strategic equilibrium, for confidence building and risk reduction. And that's where I think ASEAN does need to connect with other countries, the Quad and others. On the demographic side of things, on the human capital of Indonesia, I couldn't agree with you more. What's Australia doing? So, you know, I know, and I meet every day when I'm in this country, that there are lots of Indonesian students who study in Australia. At my college, we have masters and PhD students from Indonesia. They're usually excellent, but there are not enough of them. I think the challenge is one of scale. And so, I am personally a bit frustrated at the relative thinness of the demographic and diasporic link between Australia and Indonesia. Interestingly, Australia and India have crossed this threshold now. So in the last 25 years, we've utterly transformed that relationship, and it's been through people in many ways. And a lot of it is through education, employment, opportunity. 30 years ago, I would not have predicted that the Australia-India relationship would have leapfrogged the Australia-India relationship would have leapfrogged the Australia-Indonesia relationship, but it has. But we can learn a few lessons from that experience, and that is about scale of human interaction. So if I have advice for the Australian government, it's that we need to do education partnership with Indonesia on steroids. I would say that because I work for a university, but it shouldn't all be university, and it shouldn't all be my university, though a lot of it should be my university. But a lot of it should be vocational as well, technical vocational education at scale on cybersecurity, for example, on technology skills, on the skills that will actually help young Indonesians not only develop sustaining and fulfilling careers, but also deal with the challenges of the new economy. The fact that we're all worried about our jobs with ChatGPT, for example. So I think that's the big homework that we need to take home, and that finally ends with me on the Australia-Indonesia relationship more generally. So I think there are lots of good stories and lots of good narratives and lots of good legacies in that relationship. There's, for example, a very strong alumni between our security communities, our defence communities. We have, generations of military officers and police and other agencies that have a very deep working relationship with one another. But when you look at the totality of the relationship, it's still not substantial enough. And a lot of that is about people, but a lot of that is also about investment, economic partnership. And so, I anticipate that there'll be more coming down the track. I think that we do now have a government and a foreign minister that's refocused on Indonesia and Southeast Asia. But just as with the Indonesia-ASEAN chairmanship, this can't be a one-year thing. So let's see what we can do. And I think, this is some homework for us, because think tanks, universities, we need to be renewing and incubating those ideas. There were some great people from generations past who've worked on Australia-Indonesia relations, but we need you guys in the game now.
You have time for another round?
I've got all the time in the world, and my flight's not until 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. So,
Okay, good. All right, so we'll take a round of 4. The lady with the glasses, yeah, and then gentleman over there, gentleman in the suit, the guy, the guy with the blue shirt, yeah. Okay, and yes, okay. So please, and let's make sure it's just one question, yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Rory. Amanda Hodge from the Australian newspaper. Nice to see you in Indonesia.
We're on the record. Yeah.
We are on the record. Look, it's a very quick question, and it's quite timely. You mentioned that there is a greater level of comfort in the region now with the Quad, which is an interesting observation. I think it's probably right. We're not seeing that level of comfort with AUKUS yet. Do you, and obviously we have a big announcement coming up next week, do you anticipate that enough has been done by the government, which is surely working very hard on that front in this region, to lay a groundwork for a greater level of comfort somewhere down the track, not too far?
Shall I take that one or go to the next?
The next one.
As I said, the more I take, the easier it is to dodge the hard ones.
The back, yeah.
Thanks very much, Charlie from ANU. What does a strategic equilibrium look like in the context of China's grey zone tactics in the North Natuna Sea, for example? Would you add a bit more detail to something like that? And can this issue be solved through the Asian institutions? Or does this issue, like many others, require a bit more than that? And Pak Dino, if I may ask you a question as well, without monopolizing the microphone. To what extent does Indonesia aspire to be a pole? We're speaking about Indonesia's role as a pole. Does Indonesia aspire to be a pole? And would it require a kind of rethinking of the implementation of Indonesia's bebas active foreign policy? Thank you.
Gentleman in the middle.
Rafa from Blue Pads Lab. So I have two questions, one from Rory and one for Padino. For Rory, the question is kind of simple. So Russia and US have this fora called SSD, Strategic Stability Dialogue. So is it possible, like in terms to preserve this strategic equilibrium, to make our own versions of the SSD in order to engage with China, like for example, like from the Quad and also maybe ASEAN, and at the same time in post INF era, that the United States also rearming themselves and also rebasing some of the intermediate range missiles in the Pacific. So do you think that the arms control or arms treaty talks will be in the this strategic equilibrium trend, maybe around up until the 2025 or 2030, which is like the DoD estimates of the PLA is going to invade the Taiwan. And one question for Padino. So considering that we already have Quad, try to engaging with the ASEAN, is it time or is it necessary for ASEAN to make to engage formally with Quad, or we make our own Quad, for example, like Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, or Philippines, maybe as the framework to engage with the Quad formally? Thank you.
Gentleman in blue, yes. Yes. Yang di depannya dulu. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the time, Mr. Medcalf. Okay. First of all, how can Australia and Indonesia support strategic equilibrium in the region? As how Anglo countries should support Indonesia, like how Anglo countries did support Japan during the Meiji era, Taisho era, until post-World War II, in terms of privilege for critical technological transfer and scientific research and developments. So in this case, perhaps the Quad and AUKUS could deter the Beijing influence in Jakarta regarding for policies or political sentiments toward the Western countries. And of course, in this situation, we should perhaps reshape and revise our foreign policies and defense doctrines in the region, no longer be neutral or stand non-alignment, but also become a new alliance of the AUKUS and Quad to deter China in the growing threats against Taiwan and Japan. And of course, regarding how many Indonesian people living and working in Taiwan and Japan is very concerning in this case. Thank you.
That in back. And the last one.
Okay, thank you. My name is Hilmi. I'm from FVCI Universitas Islam Indonesia, Yogyakarta. Currently, I'm an intern in Foreign Ministry of Indonesia. I'm just wanna respond from all the dialogues here. I think that what we're doing right now is only responding and mirroring what China's doing, but not making an initiative. But is it any initiative that we do for the future? Thank you.
All right, that's a long list. Okay, I'll go straight to Amanda's question first. So, is the Australian government doing enough to reassure the region regarding AUKUS? That's kind of how I read it. And will there be a level of comfort in the future? Yeah. So look, firstly, and I think AUKUS was mentioned elsewhere as well, but I'm going to just start with a few views about AUKUS. So personally, I think it's a pity that AUKUS has an acronym, AUKUS, because it's actually really boring. It's a three-nation technology sharing arrangement. I mean, it's significant because it's very sensitive technology, especially in the case of submarines, but it's not an alliance. And I think one of the confusions about AUKUS and one of the, I think, failures of messaging that we had in the initial announcement of AUKUS was to give the impression that this was some new alliance. We already have an alliance with the United States, and Britain is not a treaty ally in the sense that it's going to be somehow a frontline security power in the Indo-Pacific. AUKUS is not part of the regional security architecture. It's a technology sharing arrangement. So my hope is that if and when, or when, we know when, my hope is that when the so-called optimal pathway announcement for the Australian nuclear-powered submarines occurs, and there are media reports that that will be next week. When that occurs, my hope is that this will essentially be a technology and capability announcement, not some grand geopolitical statement, and not some piece of advertising that makes it look like an alliance. I do think that well, certainly the regional comfort levels with the Quad have grown. There'll always be some tension there, but just as in a way the Quad made the world safe for trilateralism, I think AUKUS probably made the world safe for the Quad because it became the new sort of focus of China's unhappiness. But also the Quad has been very mature in demonstrating itself as being about public goods. I think my own message about, my own view about AUKUS is that first and foremost, it's about making Australia a stronger power to protect Australia's interests. And if countries in the region can accept that a stronger Australia is good for them, is in their interests, then I think in time they can be persuaded to accept a kind of normalisation of AUKUS, that AUKUS is really a normal part of Australia's security future. It's also worth emphasising, and I think you know this, of course, Amanda, that AUKUS has two sides, and that the submarine program, the nuclear-powered submarine program, it is exclusive trilateral cooperation with very, very sensitive technology. But the other side of AUKUS, which is advanced defence technologies such as cyber, quantum, AI, hypersonics, that's not strictly exclusively trilateral. In time, there could well be programs under that side of what is called AUKUS that involve fourth or fifth or other countries, other partners, as that circle of trust grows. So to answer your question, it's not so much a question of has Australia done enough yet to reassure the region about AUKUS. The answer is probably not. But is that an intense work in progress? The answer is clearly yes. And I have reasonable confidence that if any Australian government can do that, it's this government, because you have a government that really has turned to AUKUS more in sorrow than in anger, I might say. They've kind of inherited it. They're a progressive government. They're not a government that would naturally see themselves as sort of Sparta in the Pacific. They're a government that is turning to national security in very much a defensive way, and yet they're absolutely earnest and serious about this, and they're combining it with that deep engagement with Southeast Asia that Penny Wong has demonstrated. Look, on specific scenarios or specific circumstances like the Natunas and the what appears to be the occasional confrontations, for example, between Chinese and Indonesian vessels there, I think it's the same, in principle, it's the same dynamic as elsewhere in the South China Sea. That is, from time to time, maybe not every day, but frequently, there are risks of confrontation, and some kind of improved confidence-building measures, some kind of improved regional understanding about what is acceptable behaviour is going to reduce the risk of each individual incident from escalating. So I also don't think that there would be solutions that would be specific to a particular location. I think it's really about developing rules of interaction between the forces of all countries in the region, and that has to extend beyond militaries. It's got to be coast guards, it's got to be fishing fleets, it's got to be all of the paramilitaries and auxiliaries that China uses. You had a question for Dino as well, didn't you?
Answer after.
Yeah, okay, great. All right, now I'm getting lost again. Oh, arms control, right? So and strategic stability talks. So there was a time about 12 years ago, 13 years ago, when we had a slightly more benign strategic environment, and the US was conducting a nuclear posture review that they considered strategic stability dialogue with China, and at that point they didn't do it. And I think one reason they didn't do it is that they did not want to acknowledge China as a kind of peer competitor in the nuclear space in the same way that they acknowledged Russia. So you could almost say that back then the US denial of doing strategic stability dialogue on nuclear issues with China was a way of avoiding the perception that there was a Cold War. It was a way of saying to China, we don't consider you to be an adversary. Now that's obviously changed because China's nuclear armaments program has grown rapidly. If we're going to be worried about submarine programs in the region, we should be looking at the nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed submarines that China's already putting into the South China Sea, for example. What to do about it? I mean, I personally think that strategic stability dialogue between the US and China is a good idea. I also think that at one level we need to let them do that bilaterally, but we need to have scaffolding from the region to encourage and support that kind of dialogue, and that means that strategic stability issues, in other words, issues to ensure that confrontations don't escalate to the nuclear level, they should be happening among all our foreign ministries, in all of our dialogues with one another, and then in our communications directly to both the US and China, I guess, in my view. Are we going to solve this before 2030? No, but we've got to make a start. And I'm also a little bit wary of the predictions of which year China's going to do something aggressive across the Taiwan Strait, because it still depends on whether or not Xi Jinping wakes up and decides not today. And so I think one of the objectives of a lot of the public pronouncements about this issue is actually to discourage China from doing something crazy in the near term. But I would also note that we are in a much less friendly strategic environment for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation at the moment, so the best we can do is focus our effort on arms control. The last question that I recall I have to deal with was, no, there were two from the gentleman over here. Can you remind me, please, of your... So, gentleman in blue, you had a question?
No,
yours was for Dino. Oh, I know what it was now, yeah. Your question was actually... That was a pretty dark question because you talked about Meiji restoration, and obviously one would. I don't think it's in a sense that ended badly. the sort of technology transfer to Imperial Japan sort of didn't end so well for the world in the 1940s. But the more serious point is that I think it makes a lot of sense for Australia and other partners to be trying to make Indonesia stronger, because I think with respect to what Pak Dino has said, Indonesia may not want to be a pole, but I think the growth of its economy will make it a pole. And so it's actually in Australia's interest and others to be doing things like helping Indonesia become a much more effective naval power, to improve its maritime surveillance, to do things that we actually are quite good at. But of course, isn't just a job for Australia, it's a job for a whole lot of partners. The flip side of that is I don't think anyone expects Indonesia is going to become a treaty ally. I don't think, in one part of my brain, it would be great if Australia and Indonesia were such close treaty allies that, we were sort of protecting one another from all threats near and far. But there are halfway steps to that, which are about transparency and consultation and making sure we just don't act against each other's interests. And I think that's sort of good enough as an aspiration. And I'm sorry, your question, I have forgotten the last question.
Responding to China too much.
Yeah.
Are we just responding? Are we just responding or mirroring China, or we have some initiative to do for the future?
Yeah, well, I think, look, at one level, I like your question because, my view, when for example, Australia is criticised over the Quad or AUKUS, at one level, it's actually laughable to say that a middle power is sort of the cause of an arms race. We are responding to a deteriorating strategic environment, just as Japan or India or Sweden or Finland or others are reacting to a deteriorating strategic environment. But are we at risk of creating a security dilemma dynamic or mirror imaging China? I think that does depend hugely on the diplomacy that we do to explain what we're doing and the way in which we, if you like, build resilience in our societies at home. So yes, there's a risk, yes, there's a possibility, but I think the way Australian diplomacy is going at the moment is, you know, precisely the opposite of mirror imaging China. We're not actually saying to the region, either you for us or against us. We're actually saying to the region, we need a sense of balance and equilibrium here. We need to be all in this together. And we're also saying to our people at home, we're protecting our interests against all risks globally. And really, if China wants to behave as an adversary, well, that's a challenge that will need to be dealt with. But we actually want, for the time being, what we really want, in fact, hopefully for the long term, is a normalisation and a stabilisation with China.
Thank you. And by the way, what's your name again? Yeah, Gilmy. There's no shortage of examples where we act not because of China, but because we do it on our own. East Asia Summit. This is a totally ASEAN initiative. RCEP, right? The Regional Comprehensive Economic. That's a totally ASEAN-centric initiative. The ARF, right? The ASEAN Charter. The fact that we turn ASEAN into an ASEAN 10. You know, these are things that we do not because we want to mirror China or respond to China, but because it is in our calculation important strategic move on its own merit. Yeah. So there's plenty of examples. Yeah. Indonesia being a pole, we don't really use the term pole, but there was an effort by the first term of President Jokowi, Global Maritime Fulcrum. You remember that, right? But fulcrum implies a pole, right? But it was never implemented seriously, and even now nobody refers to Global Maritime Fulcrum anymore. But on the practical side, I think the problem I have is this. If Indonesia wants to become a pole, you have to suppose there are other countries that would want to follow Indonesia as the core country, right? So, I mean, that's the logic of being a pole, right? But look, Timor-Leste, do you think Timor-Leste considers Indonesia to be its pole, that it wants to follow Indonesia's footsteps? No, they have their own foreign policy. Yeah? Of course, they have good relations with us. Singapore doesn't, right? Singapore, of course, they consider Indonesia playing a leadership role in the region, but they would not call us their pole, right? Same thing with Brunei or Philippines or Vietnam or Thailand, right? But I think what Indonesia wants to do is, I think we have a status as primus inter pares in ASEAN, and we want to make sure that in the conduct of our foreign policy, it's not just bilaterally, but using ASEAN to add weight to our foreign policy. I mean, when I was in Washington, that worked a lot, Rory. You know, I tell everybody I'm Indonesia, fourth largest country in the world, largest Muslim population, but we're also the largest country in ASEAN. That resonates very well and adds to our diplomatic leverage. On Quad, you asked question, how should ASEAN engage Quad? Look, first, you should know that every Quad member have good relations with Indonesia and with ASEAN. Yeah. There is no threat there, yeah, and in fact, a lot of the policies, not all, but a lot of the policies are aligned. So I think, within the Quad itself, Indian Foreign Minister J. Shankar sees it more as functional cooperation, not as a security dialogue. You know, maybe the U.S. may disagree with that. I don't know about Australia. But certainly from the Indian side, they see the Quad more in terms of solutions provider on health, on trade, on economic infrastructure, and other things. And we in ASEAN would welcome that for sure. Now, would Quad, first, would ASEAN form its own Quad internally? Obviously, no, right? It's just not the way things are done within ASEAN. But what kind of relationship would we have with Quad? There's no answer to that yet. I know ASEAN must be talking about it internally, but the Quad would have to send a message to ASEAN that, look, we are a group that you want to deal with, right? Again, we are a group that you want to deal with. And so far, in my view, Quad has not sent that message. You know, Quad has been saying we support ASEAN centrality. That's great, yeah. But Quad has not sent a message to ASEAN that, hey, you have to deal with us as a group too, right? So until that ball is made gitu ya, then I don't think ASEAN will menjemput bola itu, right? Yeah. So please.
I know we're running short of time, but I'll just make one quick comment to riff off that, because you know, speaking as an Australian and someone who's been a long-term advocate of the Quad, I don't imagine that Quad members would insist that their relationship with ASEAN is exclusively through the Quad mechanism. They're all going to have good bilateral relations and ASEAN dialogue partner relations and work within the ASEAN-centric frameworks. But I do think that there will be occasions where the Quad is a logical partner, perhaps in response to events. I mean, if you look back to the tragedy of the tsunami in 2004 and the fact that, you know, in a sense, the origins of the Quad were in the mobilisation of a core group that helped key countries, you know, including Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, India in that time, then there could well be circumstances in the future where this is a partner of choice, but it may well just be in response to those circumstances. And the last thing I want to say, and this is a little bit cheeky, is that if you project forward to 2045, the aggregate weight of a different Quad, Australia, India, Indonesia and Japan, will be larger than China in every respect, including GDP and military spending, according to a lot of credible projections. Of course, the Indian population is already larger than China's. So it's also possible that if we look a few decades in the future where Indonesia may be more of a pole, and where the China challenge may be configured differently, because by that stage we may have gotten through this phase of, I think, you know, intense difficulty and competition. There could be other configurations that you know, are very authentically Indo-Pacific that we can work with. So I would like to leave friends in Indonesia with some of that creative thinking as my farewell.
Thank you. Let's give a big hand to Professor Rory Medcalf. I know I tease him about the book, but really, if you want to read just one book on the Indo-Pacific, you read Contest for Indo-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific Empire. It's really an excellent book, and I would like actually to officially propose, Professor, that we translate it into Bahasa. We're already translating Amitav Acharya's book. It will be coming in the next 2 months at the end of the American Order, and ASEAN Security Community, right? Yeah.
Look, that would be incredibly welcome, and I will happily produce some new materials exclusively for the Bahasa edition. So let's talk about that. Thank you.
And I'm sure Area will pay for it, yeah, for the translation. Good. All right. Thank you very much. Let's give a big hand to Professor Rory Medcalf. Yeah. If anyone wants to chat or take a picture with Professor Rory, most welcome.
Okay. Thank you very much once again, Dr. Dino and Professor Medcalf. Everybody, maybe once again, give a big hand of applause to our panelists. Now, Dr. Dino, Professor Medcalf, we would like to invite you for a picture together. You may just stand to the front of the stage, and we will have our photographer to capture. Yes. All right, now FPCI would like to present a little memento. All right, we have come to the end of our session of today's public lecture with Professor Medcalf. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to our lecture, and we hope to see you at the next FPCI event. Thank you.